Well, welcome everybody to our October general membership meeting. We have a lot of awesome things planned today. But first of all, here's a recap of our agenda. Like I said, we've got quite a few announcements to make, followed by an announcement from Michaela Croyne from Parks. And then we're going to have Jesse Dean from Healthcare Authority give a presentation on land acknowledgements. I don't know how many of you have noticed lately that in some of your meetings, it is becoming regular, what is it? I can't think of the word. It feels like my Monday again. But it's becoming a regular thing to acknowledge and thank the land that you're on and having the meeting. So I'm really looking forward to that presentation. So just a little bit for those of you that are new, the Latino Leadership Network, also known as LLN, is a business resource group. We strive to provide the Latinos and our allies in state government a place where they feel a sense of community, learn new things that help them advance in their professions, and to also meet other fellow Latino state workers, which sometimes it can feel like we're the only ones. But fear not, you're not alone. Our vision is to connect and inspire Washington State's Latino workforce and the leaders of today and tomorrow. And our mission is through the power of connection, invest, inspire, and serve. Something that has been coming up quite a bit is whether or not we will change our name to reflect some of the new terms that have been becoming more and more inclusive. And so I just wanted to say that while LLN does use the term Latino, we use that term for anyone who identifies as Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Chicano, or other similar identifiers. And if you could please mute yourself, I would really appreciate it. We're getting some background noise. Thank you. And a recap. So for those of you that don't know me and I didn't introduce myself, I'm Abby Chavez, the chair of LLN. And it has been so much fun this last month working with the team and just bringing all these different events for you guys to participate in. I know that sometimes our membership meetings is too late in the day and you have priorities when it comes to work and family and can't always attend our meetings. And so what we wanted to do was provide a little bit of do a little bit more flexibility when it comes to our events. So on September 14th, we had our general membership meeting, which was kicking off Hispanic Heritage Month. And we had OFM come and give an awesome presentation on the demographics for Latinos in Washington State and the Washington workforce. You can find a copy of that report on our website. And then on September 28th, Noemi Solorzano Thompson gave an awesome webinar on influential Latin American films. And just this last week, we had my DEI committee worked with another business resource group known as RAIN and gave such a wonderful lunch and learn on being LGBTQ plus and Latino, Latina, Latin, Latinx. And it was exploring the intersection of race and gender. So that lunch and learn was not recorded. But if you got to attend, then you know that it was an awesome, awesome lunch and learn. And now I'm going to kick it off to my co-chair, Tony Griego, to talk about a few things.
Well, thank you, Abby. So yeah, it's been an exciting Hispanic Heritage Month. One of the things that we were working to do when we were hopefully going to be meeting in person for a celebration was to host a caravan event. So unfortunately, with the resurgence of coronavirus and the Delta variant, we decided getting a bunch of people together in person probably wasn't the best idea. And so we've moved to all virtual events. And so instead of hosting a caravan, which is a mobile COVID vaccination site, we want to highlight some of the caravan opportunities for members. So as you can see, we have a list of different sites and locations and dates throughout the state. I believe this is also was in our newsletter. But you can find this information on the Department of Health's website at www.doh.wa.gov. So we have vaccination options in let's see, Moses Lake on, well, that was the 10th, now it's the 12th, so that's passed. But on the 16th, there's a vaccination clinic in Spokane. On the 23rd, an option in Wenatchee. On the 30th, Los Amigos is hosting one in Tacoma. And then on November 2nd, in Redmond, Washington, near my hometown of Woodinville. So we recognize that if it's past the date where you can, as a state employee, you can get your vaccination to meet the mandate, but we want to encourage you to share this with your friends, your family, and your community, because what we've seen so far is that Latinos or Hispanics in our state have been under-vaccinated due to accessibility, due to vaccine hesitancy or lack of information that's addressed to our specific communities. And so it's really important that we support our communities, as this is it's a pandemic, folks. So we wanted to raise awareness for those vaccine options. So thank you. And I think next slide, please. So the other thing I wanted to talk to the group about is our Latino Leadership Network's strategic goals for the next year. All of the business resource groups were asked to identify 3 specific goals. In part, this was asked for from the new Office of Equity, which just came into being, and from Dr. J or Dr. Johnson, who's the director of the Office of Equity, who asked us to share specific goals and then develop measures that we can measure our success in reaching those goals. And so these are a draft, but we wanted to share them with all of our members. And so what Abby and I have put together so far is that our 3 goals are to provide quality opportunities for professional development to advance promotion of Latinos in leadership positions, reestablish quarterly lunch and learn events with speakers making an impact in their community to inspire LLN members, and to build community with Latino state employees and LLN members to improve engagement of Latino state employees. So I wanted to let you know too that if you've participated in the best practices subcommittee, that we're going to be looking at these and how we might measure our success on these goals, as well as some of the demographics data that the Office of Financial Management has shared with us. So if you've participated in that previously, I'm going to be sending a meeting invite. Or if you're interested in attending that meeting, please let us know in the chat, and that way I can send you the meeting invite as well. So then slide. So as part of this, we have a call to action. So I know that y'all are some very smart people out there, and you're sharing resources with your friends. And so we wanted to crowdsource some of the resources for professional development, because I know you have good webinars, articles, or things that you would love to share that could help us promote professional development. And so we're asking for you to, if you have a resource to share, send us an email at our email address of lln@ofm.wa.gov with the subject line PD or professional development recommendation. And we're asking for articles or webinars that you've attended or you would recommend attending, videos, if there's something inspirational or something that's very practical or give you the perfect tip to maybe earn that next promotion or deal with conflict resolution. If you have guest speakers that you'd recommend, please send them our way, and that way we can share them with the rest of the group. Also, as I mentioned, one of our goals is to restart our Lunch and Learn series, because that's where we originally started from as a group, was highlighting some of the various Latino leaders in our state. And so we'd love to get those recommendations as well. If you maybe have it in with, Justice Sonia Sotomayor or somebody exciting like that we could get and come and speak to the group, we'd love to hear that. Also, we want to make sure that we give recognition to those who submit their recommendations. So please let us know, if you're comfortable with us sharing your name, so we can give you credit. Also, if you're interested in organizing or coordinating some of this work, please let us know. We're not asking you to lead a subcommittee or anything like that, or a huge project, but it is helpful to get some work, someone to help with, coordinating what we should include, or doing some quality assurance to make sure that we're not promoting somebody who maybe is problematic or has said things that would not be an ally to the Latino community, that sort of thing. But I know that you all have some great resources out there, and we would love to share that with the groups, so that everybody else in LLN can benefit from it as well. So, call to action to the group.
Thank you, Tony. And with all of that we are trying to get started again, we are taking a break in November. So there will be no general membership meeting or events the rest of October and in November, and we will be back full force and ready to kick things off for the new year, December 14th, where I'm hoping we'll have something exciting, to celebrate the holidays, which I know that Navidad is a very, very big holiday for our Latino community. So in the meantime, feel free to connect with us. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can join us on LinkedIn. YouTube is where we save as many of our recordings as possible, whether it's meetings, presentations. I know there has been a time or two where I have forgotten to hit record on our meetings. So for those that are there, they're on our YouTube page. And of course, we have our website currently on Washington State Commission on Hispanic Affairs, also known as CHA. And with that, I am going to stop sharing this presentation and pass it over to Michaela Croyne from Parks. She had something pretty cool to announce, and then we have another video from the group that was at the beginning. So Michaela.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes. I want to thank Abby. Thank you for inviting me to have the opportunity to share a little bit more about what I do and the intersection with Latino Leadership Network. I work for Washington State Parks, and I am a folklorist. And what that means is I get the opportunity to work with people from a variety of different cultural communities. And one of the reasons that we ended up sharing these songs from Trio Guadalajara was because originally, when we had been planning to do an in-person celebration in September for Hispanic Heritage Month, this group, along with one other group, was going to be coming to the park to perform in person. And while that would have been really fun, we'll hopefully get to do that another year. So in lieu of getting to celebrate that in person, I've been doing a lot of virtual events that celebrate cultural heritage and that are hopefully educational opportunities for folks that are able to watch them. And I wanted to share that when an in-person event gets canceled, as so many in-person events have over the past several years of pandemic, that can be a loss of income, a loss of gig for musicians, artists, culture bearers, craftspeople, et cetera, et cetera. And that is unfortunately the reality that a lot of our creatives are facing these days. And so one of the things that I like to do is work with these artists to figure out what's another way that we can work together so that you still get your music or your art out there, you still get a paycheck, and these cultural traditions can continue. And Trio Guadalajara is an incredible group, and they're very resilient. They do arts and education, so they teach in the classroom, and they have lots of different outlets. However, one thing that they're excited to be working on is a 3-song exploration of the history of migration of Latinx folks to Washington. And so they're starting to write these songs, and they're envisioning how to paint a musical and visual story about the history of Latinos in Washington. And so I'll be working with them over the next year to help film this in some different park locations across the state. So I know they're interested in filming in Northwest Washington and exploring, a lot of the Hispanic names that we have. So we have, Lopez Island, for example. We have the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And so their first song is going to explore that history. And the second song is going to explore some of the Latinx migration to Central Washington. And then the third song will explore contemporary Latinos in Washington. So that's going to be a really exciting project. And then for the other group that was going to be performing at Miller Sylvania, I'll be recording with them at Miller Sylvania so that we can share that virtual content later this year, and on beyond that. So that's just a little bit about what I do and how that intersects with LLN. And I'm just grateful to get to share that with you all. And if you have any other questions or ideas for things that we could work on together, it's nice to meet you all.
Thank you. And with that, I will play this video, and then after that, we will have Jesse Dean present on land acknowledgements. it amazes me how talented they are. Okay, and with that, I will pass it over to Jesse Dean from Healthcare Authority to present on land acknowledgements.
Thank you, Abby. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Could I, let's see, would it be possible to share my screen?
You should have that ability now.
There we go. All right, can you see the slide? Great. Aloha Owinala, everyone. I am Jesse Dean, Tribal Affairs Administrator for the Healthcare Authority. I'm Kanaka Uivi, it's a native Hawaiian. Born and raised in Hawaii, and my Hawaiian name is Keolame Kalani. My family trace our genealogy back to the last migrations from Tahiti, estimated around the 13th or 14th century. And for the professional introduction, I'm an attorney and have been practicing in Washington State for 19, almost 20 years now. We're here today to talk about tribal land acknowledgements, but I also wanted to make sure we talk about state agency relations with tribes, because you can't really understand one without the other as state employees. So before we start, I'm going to offer a tribal land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I live in the Black Lake area of Olympia on lands shared by the Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Upper Chehalis tribes. This area was a primary waterway portage road from the Chehalis River Basin to the Puget Sound, and I recognize that I'm a guest on these lands, and thank all of these tribes for caring for these lands since time immemorial and for allowing my family and me to live in such beautiful country. And I also commit to caring for the lands and water, plants, and animals. So we're going to first cover some brief items on tribal sovereignty and government-to-government relations. And then we'll cover land acknowledgements, tribal land acknowledgements. So tribal sovereignty and government-to-government relations with state agencies. So between 1607 and 1621, the Spanish, French, and British empires founded colonies in North America at Santa Fe, New Mexico, at Quebec in Canada, and in Virginia and Massachusetts. The European empires understood that they were dealing with occupied lands, but they also came up with concepts like the doctrine of discovery to justify their taking of occupied lands. After the US War of Independence, which ended in 1783, and the ratification of the US Constitution in 1788, the first US Supreme Court case was heard 3 years later in 1791. However, the court's early years involved few major cases. The first Chief Justice of note was John Marshall, who presided over the Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835. And in 1832, the Marshall Court issued the first of what became a trilogy of Supreme Court cases that are considered the foundations of federal Indian law. Today, we refer to these as the Marshall Trilogy. These cases are complex and beyond the scope of today's training. This quote from that first case, Worcester v. Georgia, however, helps us understand that even in 1832, the United States recognized the Indian nations as distinct independent political communities, retaining their original natural rights as undisputed possessors of the soil from time immemorial. This principle is still a foundation of US law that tribes are sovereign, particularly with respect to the states. In other words, states do not regulate tribal governments. But what is sovereignty? And I'm gonna ask folks. I don't know if that's something that I can do here in this meeting. I'd love to have some responses on what people think sovereignty means.
Would you like for people to throw their responses in the chat or unmute? They can unmute themselves.
Either one.
Perfect.
I can read from chat. And I'm starting to get some responses. Self-governance, self-governed, the original owner, I love those answers. Any others? Well, sovereignty, authority. Yes, that's a good one too. Well, Joe Dela Cruz, who served for 22 years as president of the Quinault Indian Nation, offered this explanation. No right is more sacred to a nation, to a people, than the right to freely determine its social, economic, political, and cultural future without external interference. The fullest expression of this right occurs when a nation freely governs itself. We call the exercise of this right self-determination. And the practice of this right is self-government. That is sovereignty. So, as sovereign nations, many tribes signed treaties with the United States before Washington was even a state. Here are highlights from the 8 treaties that were signed with tribes in the Washington Territory. The treaties are very similar because they were written by the United States with only minor changes allowed. In addition, the US territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, negotiated these treaties in English with Chinook interpreters, but Chinook was a trade jargon language. None of the tribal leaders had the benefit of understanding these treaties in their native languages, and they didn't understand what they were being asked to sign, and yet they were being asked to sign these treaties under threats of violence. In addition, the Indian Wars in Washington started after these treaties were signed, which is unusual since most treaties are signed to end wars. And there's a long history of that type of oddity in Washington. So why do you think the Indian War started after the treaties were signed? Well, first, Governor C. Stevens was not an ethical man. Some believe that he put the X on behalf of many tribes, even if the tribes did not agree to sign. Second, treaties didn't understand the details in the treaties. As I mentioned, these treaties were not negotiated in their native language. As a result, the treaties were signed. After the treaties were signed, the tribes learned what the US intended, and they rebelled. Third, Governor Stevens needed congressional ratification of the treaties to make them effective, which did not take place until 1859. So notice how many years it took for Congress to ratify these treaties. In the meantime, American settlers were flowing into Washington Territory, onto the tribes' reserved lands and the lands that they were ostensibly giving up under these treaties. And so in a way, the treaties, they papered over after the fact what settlers were doing on the ground. The tribal wars ended in the late 1850s, except for the Yakima War, which ended in the 1870s. And as you can see, these treaties were a massive forced exchange of value. From the tribes gave up land, the vast majority of the state of Washington, for example, and what they received in return that was in addition to what they already had, because remember, they had land, they had the rights to fish, to hunt, to whale, to seal, to pasture, all of that they already had. And so they gave up the land and the rights that were related to those lands in some situations in exchange for free healthcare for perpetuity and free education. And there's a long history about boarding schools. I'm sure some of you have seen that in the news. So even that free education that the United States promised became distorted and turned into a tool of cultural destruction and domination. Another piece that I want to highlight is the term reservation, because every treaty refers to a reservation. And some of you may think of the reservation, common thought is that it's the land. Well, reservation is a contract term because treaties are contracts. They are contracts between sovereign nations. And so the reservations are really what one party is holding on to, is not giving up. They are reserving this, and then they're giving up that. That's how a reservation works in a contract. That, again, takes a little twist because with regard to the treaties, and then after that, treaties no longer become something that the United States enters into after 1871. So, but the treaties, and then after that, the administrative process reflects that the tribes are reserving certain lands and giving up others, reserving certain rights that they've always had, such as fishing, hunting, macaw with regard to whaling and sealing. All of those rights are part of the tribe's reservation. And then the tribe gave up vast tracts of land in exchange. So I also want to highlight that many of these reservations involved, reservations were originally thought of as what the tribes retained, that land they reserved. But that meaning even changed over time, because the United States would relocate tribes onto other tribes' reservations, onto land that the United States didn't want. That was a very common practice of the United States. And so the Tulalip tribes, maybe some of you wondered, why is that plural? It's because that is actually the bringing together of a host of tribes in that region onto the Tulalip reservation, and they took that name Tulalip tribes. We also have, for example, the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, again, reflecting the history that the US relocated tribes and bands onto a specific piece of land, and then expected, the tribes and bands to exist in peace on those reservations. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, not all tribes signed treaties. In 1871, Congress ended treaty making, and that was done for various racist and nationalist reasons. And the United States government replaced treaty making with an administrative process for obtaining federal recognition. So for example, the Duwamish tribe in the Seattle area, they have been stuck in this administrative process for decades. And there are other tribes, even the Chinook tribe, the tribe from which we got the Chinook jargon, they have been stuck in this administrative process as well. So we have treaty tribes, we have administratively recognized tribes, but they are, both of those types of tribes are federally recognized. And then you have other tribes such as the Duwamish and the Chinook who have not obtained federal recognition yet. And all treaties, just a reminder, all treaties were signed under duress. So unfortunately, despite these treaties, Washington State was violating the tribe's treaty rights to fish, amongst other things. And so the Department of Fisheries and the Department of Game, now the Department of Fish and Wildlife, routinely sought to enforce regulations on tribal citizens, even though tribes are sovereign nations and not subject to state law. And in 1963, inspired by the sit-in protests, Billy Frank Jr. of the Nisqually tribe began the first fish-in. And by the late 1960s, the fish-in protest had spread throughout Washington and into Oregon, with the state continuing to arrest tribal citizens who were exercising their treaty rights to fish. These fish wars ended up in court, where the tribes prevailed with the Bolt decision of 1974, in which the federal government confirmed that tribes have a treaty right to 1/2 of the fish in Washington state. That Bolt decision was very unpopular, as you can see on the right. Even within the government, the government and agencies of the state of Washington, they appealed the decision all the way to the Supreme Court, and it took 10 years until 1984 for the state and the tribes to agree on a joint plan for cooperative management of fisheries in Puget Sound. 10 years. And the state continued to fight the tribes in other domains, such as land jurisdiction, natural resource management, land use. And out of these years of constant fighting, tribal leaders started to think there has to be a better way. As Mel Tonasket of the Colville tribe said in an interview recently, we thought, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to always go through the beginning process each time of who's got the most sovereignty? Which is the most important in governance, state or tribes? Who's the toughest? Who has the most attorneys? We wanted to develop a paper that says we'll agree. We won't fight over who's most sovereign, but we'll agree to fight if we have to, without jeopardizing the positive things that we're doing for the benefit of not only our people, but the state too. And that is the basis of the Washington Centennial Accord, which was an agreement originally between 26 tribes and the governor in 1989, and then has expanded to 28. Can you hear me now? I'm going to assume so.
Yep.
And great. And then that Centennial Accord got codified into the Revised Code of Washington, Chapter 43.376. And that is the key point of our state tribal government to government relations. Because 43.376.020 requires state agencies to, among other things, take reasonable efforts to collaborate with Indian tribes in the development of policies, agreements, and program implementation that directly affect Indian tribes and develop a consultation process that is used by the agency for issues involving specific Indian tribes. That's a mouthful, but that applies to every state agency in Washington. By the way, this chapter also requires every state agency to have a tribal liaison. For example, someone like me. And so if your state agency does not have a tribal liaison, you might want to start asking why. So why is this important? Besides the fact that tribes are sovereign nations, the state agreed to maintain government-to-government relations with the tribes because it is one of the key bulwarks against policy disasters. Throughout US history and up until today, many well-meaning unilateral federal and state policies have wreaked havoc on tribes. And I haven't even covered any of those in today's talk, but this, by engaging in that collaborative work with tribes, state agencies avoid policy disasters. Now, it's not always going to actually avoid the policy disasters, but is the best way that we can do so. In addition, and this is something that we have seen in the past 10 to 15 years, tribes have, because they know that state government has an influence on their programs, they have more and more participated in direct access to our authorizing environment. And that's both the state legislature, as well as the governor's office, and even at the federal level for some of you in state agencies that depend on federal funding. Tribes participate at all those levels because they're trying to make sure that these state and federal policies don't cause harm. So brief thought experiment just for us to sort of think through what government-to-government relations means. We have the state government and the federal government represented by the two flags. We have Kitsap County. Now we have three governments involved, and the government-to-government relations, they take on different aspects when you're talking about state to county, state to the feds, federal government to county. They have different flavors to them. They also have a level of respect as to what each government is responsible for. We also have the state of Washington and Canada, right? So we even maintain relations with the Canadian government, particularly over management of the Columbia River Basin, for example. And we work with the state of Oregon on many issues. And there's the Colville Confederated Tribes. So a key takeaway here is that tribes are at the same level, really, as from the federal perspective, as states. States do not regulate tribes. That said, tribes will say that they are sovereign nations and that they, are at the level of Canada and the United States. And so this is a point of contention between tribes and the federal government. And so it's just important to keep that in mind as well. But the final point here is that everything above that line are governments and everything below that line are stakeholders, and never refer to a tribe as a stakeholder, ever, ever, ever. I made that mistake in my first year at Healthcare Authority. I wasn't even in this role, and I learned. So just remember that tribes are governments, and we have an obligation to collaborate with them as partners, as government partners. And that is a very different form of collaboration compared to, the people we serve, the entities we regulate, and the entities that we serve. So just some best practice tips. Be mindful of opportunities to consult and partner. Be respectful of tribal government processes and timelines. I often have people asking, why do we have to send a physical letter? That seems very archaic. It's because tribal governments have processes, and we need to respect their process so that they can engage with us. Be sure to reach out to the right tribal staff. it happens often where people are trying to reach a particular tribal department, and then they communicate with a different tribal department, and then they think that they communicated with the tribe. Well, that's wrong. It's like reaching out to Department of Wildlife when they should be reaching out to Healthcare Authority. Spend time developing and enhancing those relationships, and then finally be proactive in giving warm handoffs. So that's my spiel on government to government and best practices. And now I want to talk about tribal land acknowledgements. So what is a tribal land acknowledgement? It's a verbal recognition that indigenous people have been stewards of lands and waters on this continent for tens of thousands of years. And tribal land acknowledgements are generally offered at the beginning of meetings and gatherings. So here's an example from the federal government website. That's for a poster. Why do a tribal land acknowledgement? Well, some of the benefits are that it recognizes the profound relationships between indigenous people and the land. Indigenous people have many of them have origin stories to their lands. For my people, Kanaka Oiwi, we have origin stories to the islands and to the oceans. And that is a fundamentally different relationship to land and to water than thinking of land as a sellable commodity, or thinking of land as something you extract resources from. That's the key difference in indigenous ways of being. And then that ties in with sustainability and with family obligations, because the family then is not just our human relatives. The family includes the earth, the plants, the animals. So it is an attempt to recognize the profound relationships between indigenous people and the land. It also acknowledges the historical and continuing impacts of colonization, and that has interfered with the relationship every tribe has with their land. No tribe has been immune from colonization. But that also has dangers, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. It also thanks the tribes as caretakers of the land since time immemorial. And this is a practice that is a work in progress. So it also, I've seen more and more, it reflects a commitment to taking care of the land and waters, including the plants and animals. So I just want us to, that those are some of the benefits and some of the purposes of a tribal land acknowledgement. But tribal land acknowledgements are not without controversy. And this is a very important point, which is why I prefaced all of this with that first presentation on that government to government relationship. Because tribes are governments, and tribes are very, they're busy governments. They're working on relations with the state, with the federal government, at all of those agencies at the federal level. They're having to maintain relationships with all of those, multi-headed hydras of the state and federal government. And so as governments, tribes have priorities. And one of the priorities, or one of the things that I've never heard a tribe prioritize, is a tribal land acknowledgement. Remember that, or think about that. So this is a practice that has, taken on a life of its own in the public space. All the state agencies are seeing people ask for tribal land acknowledgements, but this is not a practice that has been requested by tribes. So tribal leaders have had to essentially try to, figure out, how do I want to react to this? And as you can imagine, this is something that is requiring a lot of thought and a lot of analysis on the part of, within Washington State, 29 individually federally recognized tribes. One of the concerns that tribes have is that a tribal land acknowledgement is like, someone who steals someone's house, and so now you're living in the house, you stole that person's house, and then every time you see that other person that you stole their house, you remind them that you stole their house and that you're living in their house. Think about how traumatizing that is, just the very fact of doing a tribal land acknowledgement. It's reminding people of that harm and the continuing harm. In addition, tribal land acknowledgements, I have seen tribal land acknowledgements done very badly. And when they are not done appropriately, they can be re-traumatizing to American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so this is a complex arena where, yes, there are benefits of a tribal land acknowledgement. I have seen the benefits in various, organizations where it has changed the culture. You have some of these for-profit organizations that before, never thought of tribes, but by instituting a tribal land acknowledgement in their in office within their entities, that practice, they have shifted the culture, and now the culture involves thinking more about tribes. And so there is a benefit, but we really also need to be careful in how we do this. And so that's why here at the Healthcare Authority, we developed the guidance, and that's what you'll see next, so that Healthcare Authority staff could offer tribal land acknowledgements that are not re-traumatizing. But the last point here is that tribal land acknowledgements, this is a practice that is in flux. So we have, for example, we have had some state agencies asked, well, you should put a tribal land acknowledgement in the lobbies of your office buildings. Well, that is a very different thing from having someone just do a tribal land acknowledgement before a meeting, because now it's this physical, statement by the state agency. Well, remember what we looked above, collaboration with tribes in the development of policies that might influence or affect tribes. Now we are seeing tribes say, oh, hold on, we need to have consultation on this. And there are some discussions of actually having a statewide guidance on how we do tribal land acknowledgement. So all of this is in flux. My team at Healthcare Authority developed this guidance to try to fill in that gap, but all of this may change. So if you are going to prepare a land acknowledgement, a tribal land acknowledgement, what do you do? Well, one thing to remember, there is no one right way to make a tribal land acknowledgement. Tribal land acknowledgements vary. They're very context sensitive. They vary depending on where the gathering is taking place, who's attending, who's delivering the statement. If you are, for example, having a meeting at a tribe, and that tribe, you've asked that tribe to, essentially welcome everyone as part of a protocol, a tribal land acknowledgement, you should be checking in with that tribe whether they want you to do that. If you are having a meeting that's only, internal office staff, then a tribal land acknowledgement, you can maybe be more, have a little more freedom in thinking about what kinds of things you want to say in your tribal land acknowledgement. But one thing that you should always do is make sure that your tribal land acknowledgements are humble and heartfelt. And they are going to feel uncomfortable. So the more you do them, the more comfortable you will be. But the main point is, please make sure they are humble and heartfelt. So here are some tips. The person opening the meeting or the leader of the meeting should be the one offering the tribal land acknowledgement. And that person should be the one researching, preparing, and then delivering the tribal land acknowledgement. I have seen some meetings where the tribal land acknowledgement is delegated to someone to prepare. No, that is inappropriate, because now essentially you have the person who's leading the meeting is essentially saying that they're too busy for this. Well, if they're too busy for this, then don't bother giving it. The tribal preparation should never be delegated. I've also seen meetings where the delivery of the tribal land acknowledgement was delegated to a person of color, completely offensive. It should always be the person leading or facilitating the meeting. That's the person who should be giving the tribal land acknowledgement. Like I mentioned, if the tribe is hosting the meeting, check with them. The tribal land acknowledgement is meant to really be in lieu of the tribe's protocols in situations where the tribe is not welcoming people to the land. And so if you do have a tribe involved, please check with the tribe. So what should be in it? State your location. If it's a tribal land acknowledgement, so you need to talk about the land you're on, where you're speaking from. So like when I started this presentation and gave my tribal land acknowledgement, I shared with you about the land I'm speaking from, which is my home in the Black Lake area. You want to state your location and do the research on that land. I have never learned the native name for this land, so I can't offer it. But if you are able to learn the native name for the land, try to use it, but make sure you pronounce it correctly. Recognize and name the tribe or tribes who are the original and current people of the land and water. And remember that tribal lands often did not have clear boundaries. Again, I refer to my tribal land acknowledgement at the beginning of today's presentation. I referred to 3 different tribes because tribes did not have boundaries for some areas. And so for some areas, tribes co-managed those regions. Like here, because this was a portage road, this was well traveled, and tribes co-managed this region. You also want to thank and honor the tribes and their ancestors, their leaders, but thank them for being the stewards of the land and water. And then finally, this is something that I've been seeing more and more, an expectation that you make a commitment to caring for the land and waters, for those plants and animals. Some tips for tribal land acknowledgements. Make sure you do those 3 things. Acknowledge the relationship between the tribes and the land you're on. Thank the tribes for taking care of that land and allowing you to be on the land. You might have noticed that I acknowledge that I am a guest on this land. This is my home, but I am a guest. And then finally, commit to caring for the land and waters. You'll want to keep it personal, specific, and simple. Almost every tribal land acknowledgement that I have seen that has gone awry has gone beyond, has become complicated. The presenter wanted to say more than just what we're recommending here. And that's where you run into some problems. So you want to keep it personal, tied to the land that you're speaking from, specific, the land you're speaking from, and simple. Also, research and practice pronouncing any native names and words beforehand. You do not want to be up in Bellingham and mispronouncing the Lummi Nation's name. Not only is it embarrassing, it shows that you didn't really care. So research and pronounce native names before you give the tribal land acknowledgement. One thing that I have learned, and this is something that I hope is helpful for people, I have been mispronouncing Puyallup, the name Puyallup, for years. And I only learned that I was mispronouncing it by watching a website that the Puyallup tribe, I just mispronounced it, has about tribal land acknowledgements. And when I listened to the person speaking in the Puyallup language and pronouncing the Puyallup tribe's name, the way they pronounced it was Puyallup, not Puyallup. So, that's a hard one for me to learn because I've been pronouncing it Puyallup for years. But that's something that we should always be open in learning, is how to pronounce native names. And then our final recommendation, and this was a recommendation that my team developed for the Healthcare Authority, is to put all the words on the slide and just read from the slide. Reason, I know that's bad practice. You can see me, I'm talking off the slides and not just reading what's on the slide. But for a tribal land acknowledgement, it is again to try to minimize the risk that you're going to say something wrong and then cause harm. So we recommend put all the words on the slide and read from the slide. Some things to avoid. Avoid apologies. Apologies are meaningless without change. I tried to instill that in my children. You can tell me sorry, but if you're not going to change your behavior, then your apology is meaningless. Here, this is even bigger than that. This is about land that was taken away, and apologies for the taking of the land. What are you going to do to try to fix that and prevent that from happening again? This is a very complex topic. So avoid apologies, avoid grand promises. This is something that I've seen time and again. There are a lot of people who want to make these commitments to reconciliation, to truth and reconciliation. Well, that's a society-wide need. That is not something that an individual can promise. An individual can't promise that, the land will be given back. That is a big endeavor. So avoid grand promises, because if you think about the history of indigenous people, and it's not unique, right? Many populations in Washington, in the United States, have been made promises and then had those promises broken. That's the issue here. You do not want to make a promise and then break it. It's better not to have a promise at all. Third, avoid focusing on past injustices. And I know this is hard for many people. You want to talk about tribal land acknowledgements and talk about the injustice. And you heard me talk about that a little bit in my own tribal land acknowledgements. The challenge here is that when you start focusing on the past injustices, that starts creating the risk of re-traumatization, and perhaps worse, the risk of doing it inaccurately and inappropriately. It takes a lot of knowledge in this area, like in any other area, to be able to do something appropriately. And so what we recommended for healthcare authority staff is just avoid focusing on those past injustices, because it is very easy to get it wrong. And then avoid numbers, avoid statements about tribal cultures, and avoid statements about tribes being resilient or still here. Again, yes, tribes are still here. My people, Kanaka Oiwi, we are still here. But we don't need people to remind us that we are still here. We know we're still here. And we also know that the United States as a whole developed all of these policies to try to make us disappear. And so when it's brought up that we are resilient, it can come across as patronizing. That's not something you want. You don't want people to feel patronized. You don't want to have your tribal land acknowledgement taken in a bad way. That's why we recommended that avoid making statements about tribes being resilient, avoid making statements about tribal cultures. I never want to hear someone talking about how beautiful the Native Hawaiian culture is. I know my culture is beautiful, but when you start talking like that, it makes you sound like you are exoticizing and fetishizing, and that is not going to be taken well. So, we recommend avoid statements about tribal cultures. Also avoid numbers. You will be surprised at how many people will, even in a tribal land acknowledgement, use the wrong number of tribes for Washington State. I have heard it. The 27 tribes of Washington. Oh, that really is bad. That shows you did not do your homework. So just avoid numbers. We want to keep this simple. The focus is on the tribal land acknowledgement, not on the facts surrounding that. So I'm almost done, and then we'll get to discussions. This is the last slide. So many of you are familiar with this map. This is a website called native-land.ca. And this is a traditional tribal lands map tool that was developed by a group in Canada. It's a really cool tool, I have to say. But it has its limits. You cannot just look at this and then rely on it and make a tribal land acknowledgement out of it. It has its limits. These were folks in Canada who created this for the world. Imagine all of the mistakes they've made. So here, what we recommend, you'll see at the top, we developed HCA guidance, and we still haven't issued it that yet. That's because the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs might be issuing guidance in the future, so we didn't want to issue something prematurely. But here are some resources. This first one, Current Tribal Lands at washingtontribes.org. That is a fantastic resource for current information on tribes. That is a website that's maintained by the tribes, and it shows you where all the tribes are located and gives you more information if you're wanting to learn about each of the federally recognized tribes in Washington state. So if you're wanting to understand where are current tribal lands, that's a good place to look. But also remember that that website, excuse me, because it is about federally recognized tribes and about today, it doesn't reflect necessarily where the traditional lands of the different tribes were located. It only reflects the reservations of the tribes today. And so that is one resource among many that you should be using. The second resource, Traditional Tribal Lands, that is a fairly good resource. You can see here some of the names. You can see Clallam County or Clallam as in the Clallam tribe. But again, remember, this is just a guide. When you see Clallam there, it's actually today that refers to the lower Elwha Clallam tribe, whereas if you're in the Port Angeles area, whereas if you're in the Sequim area, that is now today referred to as the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe. And so this mapping tool is just a first cut at helping you sort of narrow down where you should be looking. I do have a key point though, and I wish they didn't do this in that Canadian mapping tool. They refer to Coast Salish. Don't use it. I know, unfortunately, the Kraken team has been referring to Coast Salish in their tribal land acknowledgement at the beginning of their games. Really bad idea. There is no tribe named Coast Salish. It's every tribe has their own name. And Coast Salish is an anthropological catch-all that was meant to sort of put into a category the tribes that shared a common culture on the Salish Sea. Don't use Coast Salish. It shows what I have heard a tribal leader refer to the Kraken land acknowledgement as sad. And so you don't want people to be looking at your tribal land acknowledgement as sad. You want it to be taken as heartfelt. So don't use Coast Salish. A key point. So as you're developing your tribal land acknowledgements, go to history. History is very helpful in understanding, what tribes were there. And historylink.org, fantastic resource. It's all online. You get multiple viewpoints. Now, unfortunately, as with many things history related, it's typically going to be from the settlers' perspective. But if you're trying to figure out what tribes were in that area, you can sometimes find out through that website what tribes were in that area. That's how I found out that the Chehalis, Squaxin, and Nisqually tribes were all in this area. And so I find that historylink.org to be a great resource. And then finally, if you know, for example, that you are within on the lands of a certain tribe or a certain tribes, plural, go check their websites. Interestingly, the Puyallup tribe has guidance on how to do tribal land acknowledgements, for their lands. So there's nothing better than to go to the tribe's own website, follow their guidance, and then develop a tribal land acknowledgement that is respectful for the tribe that you're acknowledging. So we recommend that for all tribal land acknowledgements. Check out that tribe's website. To my knowledge, only the Puyallup tribe has guidance on tribal land acknowledgements, but I wouldn't be surprised if that, if more tribes start offering that type of guidance in the future. And so with that, those are that was my presentation. I see someone has their hand raised. Abby, how should we do this?
As people are raising their hand, if you want to call on them, they can unmute themselves and ask a question, or you guys are more than happy to throw your questions in the chat. I will say that if we happen to run out of time, we will put our LLN email address in the chat for you to submit your questions, and then maybe, Jesse, we can email you any additional questions that are asked.
Absolutely, happy to do that.
Perfect.
Well, I think there was someone had their hand raised and that went away.
It looks like Laura and then Monica.
Laura?
Oh, hello. Oh, thank you so much for this presentation. This is it's fantastic, and it really serves me to my work because I work for the DOT and we're performing the Feast Passage junction. So I have a couple of questions and another question for my volunteer work very quickly. My first question was that, as you notice, I have an accent, and I recall a few years back, and the things what to do is read from the slide of the presentation. And I think I did a mistake not to do that. And somebody did a comment back, you know, for my boss and say, well, she was not clear what she was trying to say. So, and since then, you know, I'm more careful about it, but I never read what to do. Could you shed some light about why is that? I will be more careful in the future.
Let me answer that question, then we can get to your second one. So really, the reason we're recommending that people read from the slide for tribal land acknowledgement is to avoid adding things, because that's where you start running to risks. When you start talking about, you know, you feel like you want to talk about the genocidal history, right? And that's at front of mind. And if you don't have, if you're not reading from the words on the screen, then that opens you up to that risk of, oh, maybe I should keep on adding more. And that really then can end up causing harm to the people that, you know, you're trying to actually uplift.
Okay, and my second question is, do you think that when we speak to tribal land, if you have an accent, do you have any recommendation how to approach and be sure that we were understood?
That's a really interesting question. I would say, you know, we are all even though this is the United States, and so there is this colonial history where we're all, you know, English is the dominant language. Especially when you're working with tribes, we all understand that we have our own languages. Many of us may not be fluent in those languages anymore. So I think there's a lot of grace from tribal communities in terms of, you know, people who may not speak English as a first language.
Okay, thank you so much. And my last question is about, I live here in Bothell, and the city purchased Wayne Park, and they're planning to do a park, but it's part of the tribe. But they told me that it's not a recognized tribe. Samamish, could you shed some light about talking about the unrecognized tribes? And is the last hope? There is no way that they will be ever recognized. I would like to know more about that. Thank you, and great presentation.
Thank you, Laura. That's a great question. So we have two types of federally recognized tribes. We have those tribes that sign treaties, and so they were part of that initial agreement before 1871, and they are, you know, by definition, federally recognized tribes. But you also then, since 1871, the federal government has run an administrative process, because essentially Congress said, we're not going to ratify any more tribal treaties because, you know, they're going to go away anyway. And, you know, there's a very racist nationalist viewpoint. So they then delegated that federal recognition process to the Department of the Interior. So the Department of the Interior now has a full administrative process that frankly is pretty racist in terms of all the check boxes that have to be selected in order for a tribe to qualify for federal recognition. That's how, for example, the Duwamish tribe and the Chinook tribe, and there are other tribes, have not been able to gain federal recognition because they haven't satisfied the administrative steps to gain recognition from the federal government. There is another route to federal recognition, and that is where Congress can pass a law that recognizes tribes. And actually, I believe it was last year or the year before when a whole bunch of tribes in Virginia were able to get federal recognition by act of Congress. So there is a way for Congress to do that, but those are the only two ways. So, these tribes that do not yet have federal recognition, don't think of them as, they will never get federal recognition. Just think of them as they are stuck in this administrative bureaucratic nightmare. And at some point, they may get out of it. And they may gain federal recognition either by, prevailing through the administrative process or by getting Congress to fix it.
Monica, do you want to go next?
Yes, I'll be pretty quick because I see some really great questions in the chat as well. So I am located in California. What do you recommend for us remote workers when we would like to provide the land acknowledgement at the beginning of our internal meetings?
Speak from the land you're speaking from. So that's something that I've heard loud and clear. So speak about the land that you are, in California that you're speaking from.
Okay, thank you.
Jesse, we have some questions in the chat, but could you cover the RCW that I think you mentioned that in the first slide about agencies needing or having a tribal liaison?
Yep, absolutely. And so I'm actually just going to bring up the RCW.
And I can add a little bit more context. That was my question. Just because I'm an auditor and I recently, well, it's been almost 3 years now, but work at the state treasurer's office. So as most of you are aware, there's a lot that applies to cabinet agencies in terms of compliance and requirements, but they don't necessarily apply to like the legislative offices. It's always very common to follow suit, to make sure that we are doing what everybody else is doing, but it's not always required. So that's why I was curious about when you mentioned the RCW.
So yes, no, that's a great question. So here is the RCW, and in the definition, we see state agency means an agency, department, office, or the office of a statewide elected official of the state of Washington. So this isn't even just cabinet agencies. These are all state agencies.
Yep, it makes it very clear. So that may be something that I'm going to have to look into at our office. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. I know that even in my agency, most people did not know this had passed back in 2012. And it was only in like 2017 that I was like, hey, we need to make sure that we comply with this. Because not only, so that's subsection 10. Here's subsection 20. What I didn't read to you, you can see this is the part about collaborating with Indian tribes. But here's the second part, designate a tribal liaison who reports directly to the head of the state agency. That's in the law.
Yes, it is. And there's no language there that says maybe yes, maybe no. It is very, very clearly stated there.
Yep.
So that's awesome. Thank you.
Another follow-up question that was in the chat, and you probably saw it, Jesse, is where would I research if the agency I work for has a tribal liaison staff? HR?
Yeah, I would think so.
Where should I start to see
every state agency is different. So I would hope that the state agencies would all have organizational charts with a tribal liaison on it. I know some state agencies are smaller, so they may not have a dedicated tribal liaison, or even a whole office the way Healthcare Authority does. But maybe reach out to the HR office to find out.
Did I miss any questions, Abby? Or Jesse, I don't know if you were reading it.
Let me go back. I know that Victor had asked one, do tribes have any representation at international bodies like United Nations or the World Health Organization?
That's a great question. Tribes participate, and I know, for example, Kanaka Uivi organizations, Native Hawaiian organizations participate at the United Nations. And The United Nations has United Nations actually has a decolonization process, so that if an imperial government like the United States were to want to decolonize, for example, to pull out of Hawaii, there is a process for that. The United Nations has a process for that, and it is not just to pull out and let you just fight it out amongst yourselves and kill each other. That is not what the United Nations wants people to do. So, so I do know that tribes participate at the United Nations level. The challenge that we face for all indigenous peoples, including tribes and tribal nations, is one of capacity, because tribal nations can be fairly small, and they are trying to engage with every state agency and every federal agency, and it is very easy to get overwhelmed just by maintaining relations with the state and federal government. And I'm not even talking about offering services to their people. So I do know tribes participate at the international level, but I also know that the participation is, sort of as much as they can, and tribes often will sort of tag team. So you'll have one tribe represent a bunch of tribes to the extent that they're able to. And then if not, then they'll come back and say, oh, I need more, I need you to come with me, or someone else should go. So it's a very complex process at the international level. I do like the comment about stakeholders hold the stake in the periphery, partners sit at the table. That's exactly how tribes think about the word stakeholders.
Mhm. That was the point made by Alfie.
There
So
was
there's
one other one, Olita.
from Ernesto, or which
Mhm. Yeah.
one? If tribes are sovereign nations, why call them tribes instead of nations? And then Laura asked, what is the proper name as a tribes or Indian nations?
Those are great questions. And there's another related one from Ernesto, which is the term tribe, would it be appropriate to exchange for nation or people?
Mhm.
So I recently just gave some feedback to someone within HCA on a tribal land acknowledgement that referred to people. So we referred to the tribe and referred to them as people. The important thing here is that there is a long history of the term tribe. So many of the federally recognized tribes that have sovereign status, they have tribe in the name, like the Puyallup tribe. And so the key is to, first of all, use the name that they have. So you wouldn't say Puyallup people or Puyallup nation, you would say Puyallup tribe. But also to remember that there's a lot of fluidity here. So for example, our agreements, we have a master level agreement with tribes, and we refer to that agreement as Indian Nation agreements. We could have referred to it as something else, but that's what we came up with. And there's a lot of fluidity here. So their tribes will use Indian nation, tribal nation, tribe. If you're talking generically, tribes are, there's no requirement to use just one word. But if you are talking about a specific tribe, use their name.
Monica?
Yeah, I agree, Dean, because Indian, it's just a mistake about the time of Columbus. They got the wrong way. So coming from, they were going to the Indian route to find the silk, and then they come up. So I think in my opinion is we should eliminate Indian because it's just so unrealistic anyway. So it's just kind of a comment that, but I mean, in the future, I will mention Tuala Nation, Wamis Nation, that sort of thing. But thank you. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and even the term Indian. So you might have heard me refer to American Indians or Indian Nation. Indian, yes, it is a fluke of a mistake that the Europeans messed that up. But the problem is that that is the history that we have today. So native people on the continent refer to themselves as Indian. Who are we to tell them not to use the term?
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And so, you know, you will hear Indian, you will hear American Indian. In federal
Okay.
law, the word is Indian or American Indian.
Okay,
So
thank
that's
you.
why I use those terms. And you will see that, you know, I mean, until the laws change and the culture changes, I don't think you will ever see the use of the term Indian go away.
Yeah, they missed the GPS.
Absolutely.
I think Steve has
Thank you.
one last question, and go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Jesse. This was so good, so good. And I think that through this presentation, what you've got me thinking about is giving the researching and giving the acknowledgement with humility, etc. Because to me, it brings up appropriation versus knowledge and respect. There's a wide channel between them. And then I wanted to ask a question. A pronunciation of cities versus tribes. I'm from like Jovita, Yakima, is or Puyallup, the city. Do you have to pronounce the city? Should you pronounce the city differently too, or can you talk about that?
That I think is a personal choice. I try to pronounce it, you know, ideally try to pronounce it based on the tribe's pronunciation. And that also comes from my history, right? I'm from Hawaii. I'm going to pronounce the Hawaiian words the correct way. I don't care whatever anybody else says. But at the same time, I also acknowledge that sometimes there is, you know, there is a need to communicate, and sometimes you don't want to get into all of that. So this is where code switching starts coming into play.
Yeah.
And you know, like I'm from Hawaii. We refer to we don't use the term karaoke. We say karaoke. But I came here and I switched to using the term karaoke because I got tired of people not understanding me. So that's, you know, it's about code switching. It's about just context. I think that's you know, one thing.
I think that's a good recommendation. Thank you.
I also love that you brought up that again, that, you know, the recommendation for humility. In my culture, you never fight over when the you know, our staple is poi. It's made from kalo, taro. You never fight when the poi is on the table. Completely inappropriate. You always wait until that the poi gets put away, and then you might get into your argument. You don't want to bring anger into a tribal land acknowledgement. That's the key. Because then that's where you start re-traumatizing, right? Because then you are feeding your anger instead of feeding the people that you're wanting to honor. And so that's I think one of the key points that I wanted to try to make with regard to that humility and what we try to do to focus people on the land, because that ancestral origin, you know, relationship that indigenous people have with the land, that's sacred. So what tribal land acknowledgement is about is honoring that sacredness of land to indigenous people, and you do not want to mix that up with anger, because then it will fall flat and it will not feel right.
Thank you. And when you talked about the relationship to the land, I thought about Secretary Hallen's hearings when they asked, what were you thinking when you were trying to protect this? I can't remember which animal. She said, well, I was thinking about the animal.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Abby, is she there?
I'm here. I'm stepping in for Abby.
Oh,
Jovita.
Tony. Okay, go ahead. I was like, oh, where did I lose my host?
Well, I think that's everything we have for today. I want to say, number one, thank you for everybody for joining us today and for joining us over the course of Hispanic Heritage Month. Big A huge thank you to Jesse. I feel like I learned so much from this in a way that really is impactful to me as a person, but also, you know, helping me to be a better state employee and serve all the residents of Washington State. I think this is also something that I was excited to learn more about because, you know, for Latinos and Hispanic people, there's for many of us, there's also, you know, a legacy of indigenous cultures that, you know, were colonized as well by Spaniards and the Portuguese. And so to have this connection and better understanding, especially with our within our local region, is really important and impactful. So huge thank you. I know that I'm going to go back to this recording over time and share it also with many people at my agency. So thank you. Please, again, if we have questions in that we missed something today, please let us know and email us at LLN@ofm.wa.gov. Oh, I guess we have one quick question from Anahi. Jesse, what's the best word? Should we native or indigenous when we're referring to people?
That's a really interesting question because indigenous they have slightly different connotations, right? I mean, one funny thing about the English language is you have a million words for the same thing. So it really, again, you know, I think it depends on context, right? Indigenous is not a language accessible word. Native is, right? So in some things you want to use the word native, but then in other situations, indigenous might make more sense. So I'd say it depends on the context. I use either one based on context.
And Jesse, next month is, I don't want to get it.
Native
wrong.
American Heritage Month.
Thank you. I wasn't going to try and say it wrong. So, but thank you. Perfect timing, I think. And we'll probably have more questions for you that you can answer later and we'll share them.
Happy to do that.
Because
thank you, everyone.
There's lots of questions on the chat.
Yeah, and we usually get our recordings up within a week or two of the event. So you know, keep an eye out. We'll probably also feature it in our newsletter. Once again, we're going to take a break for November from general membership meetings to give everybody a moment to pause and catch their breath. I know things have been pretty busy lately with everything going on with vaccine mandates and everything else. So again, I want to remind you too, we highlighted some caravan options for communities to get vaccinated for the COVID-19. I believe our DEI subcommittee and best practices subcommittee will still be meeting over that time. So that's another great way to get involved. And then we'll be back December 14th with our general membership meeting and looking to do some things that are maybe a little bit more fun as we enter the holiday season. Thank you. We really appreciate you. Oh, call to action again. If you have recommendations for professional development resources, whether that's a webinar, an article, a book, or a possible guest speaker, please, again, send it to us at our email address and let us know so we can give you credit for that recommendation as well. So thank you. We really appreciate everybody joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Latino Leadership Network general membership meeting. All right. Adios, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, I'm going to sign off now. Bye. How do I?
Abby's still there?